My name is Captain Elise Carter. I used to think that being a soldier made me stronger than most. 14 years in the U.S. Air Force, countless missions, multiple citations for leadership and service. I knew how to take pressure. I knew how to handle chaos, give commands, and make split-second decisions that could save lives. But none of that training prepared me for the quiet unraveling of my own marriage. Jake and I met during officer training. He worked in logistics and had this easygoing charm that drew people in. We got married fast, like a lot of military couples do. When you're surrounded by war zones and rotating deployments, you learn to cling to anything that feels like home. At first, Jake seemed proud of me. He'd joke that he'd married up, that I was the real badass in the relationship. But slowly, those compliments shifted. His tone changed. Instead of saying, "My wife's a captain," he'd smirk and say things like, "Yeah, she outranks me on paper, but we all know who runs the house." It was supposed to be funny. People laughed. I laughed. And then I cried alone. I brushed it off, told myself he was just insecure, that maybe the teasing was his way of coping with being in my shadow. I made excuses for him the way military spouses are taught to do: sacrifice, endure, stay loyal. Loyalty meant everything to me. That's what the Air Force drilled into us. But in our home, that word started to feel one-sided. He never hit me. Never yelled. That would have been easier to call out. No. Jake chipped away at me with little comments. "You're not as sharp since you started leading that unit. You sure that wasn't luck? You don't want to end up like Colonel Morris. Cold, alone, no kids, just medals." Every jab had a smile behind it, like I was too sensitive if it stung. And I started believing maybe I was. That's what scared me the most. I could command a squadron, but at home, I was second-guessing myself over what cereal to buy. He'd double-check everything I did, laugh when I mispronounced something. I thought I was tired, burned out. I blamed deployment stress, budget meetings, and the grind. But deep down, I felt something was off. Still, I stayed. I told myself it was a phase, that all marriages had tension. I kept showing up to work, leading my team, earning respect, and coming home to a man who treated me like a joke in slow motion. The shift happened during a military dinner. It was one of those formal events, long tables, polished shoes, speeches. Jake was seated next to me, glass of bourbon in hand. He seemed relaxed, maybe even proud. The dinner was supposed to be a celebration. Our unit had completed a months-long logistics overhaul ahead of schedule, and I'd been asked to say a few words. I spent hours polishing my boots and making sure everything looked sharp. Jake seemed in a good mood when we arrived. He joked with the other officers, poured drinks like he owned the room. I let myself relax, just enough to think maybe we were okay again. The general sat 2 seats down. My squadron commander was across from me. The air buzzed with laughter. When my name was called, I stood with that familiar stiffness. I opened with a story about our youngest crew chief solving a last-minute fuel routing issue, and the room laughed right where I'd hoped they would. Then, as I was mid-sentence something about operational readiness scores, Jake leaned toward the major next to him and said, loud enough for our entire section to hear, "Elise commands jets but can't even figure out our thermostat. Had to sleep in a sweatshirt last week." It wasn't a shout, but it was loud enough. Enough for the few people nearby to hear it and snort into their drinks. One of the captains slapped Jake's back like he'd landed a great punch. I kept talking. My voice didn't break. But in my mind, it did. Something about the look on Jake's face. How proud he was of making me small. I finished the speech, sat back down, tried to laugh politely when someone raised a toast, but I couldn't taste the food after that. My mind just played that line on repeat. It wasn't just the joke. It was how normal it had become for him to tear me down in public. After dinner, in the hotel room, I asked him why he said it. He shrugged and said it was just a joke, that I was being sensitive. I nodded, like I believed him. I didn't. I turned off the lights and lay there for hours, replaying every laugh. I thought about how many little digs I'd let go. But this time was different. This time, it echoed. It started with a shared laptop. Jake had left his open on the kitchen table, and I needed to forward myself a training file. We trusted each other with our devices. Or at least, I thought we did. I typed in the file name, and a recent document popped up. The title was strange. Elise. Cognitive. Notes. My stomach tightened, but I clicked anyway. It was a running log. Dates, times, what I'd said, how I'd reacted to things. There were entries like Feb 16, Elise irrational about missing towel, possibly stress-induced, and March 2, overreacted to change in dinner plans, noted visible agitation. Paragraphs followed, breaking down how often I skipped meals, how many hours I slept, and every time I'd raised my voice, I froze. It read like a clinical case file, cold, strategic. Not a single line hinted at care or concern, just evidence. Out of instinct, I opened his email. I knew I was crossing a line, but whatever line existed had already been blown to pieces. That's when I found the threads. He'd been writing to a retired major from Base Legal, a guy he called a mentor. In one message, Jake wrote, "I've been documenting incidents. She's becoming erratic. I couldn't breathe. My husband wasn't just making jokes. He was building a case against me." I kept scrolling, digging deeper. And then I found the email that connected everything. It was about the Phoenix Project, a defense contract I was leading. Jake wrote, "Major, here is more documentation for the file. She was agitated all night. If I can get her flagged as unfit for command, based on these cognitive incidents, the board will have to suspend her credentials. As her primary partner on the project, I'll be first in line to take over the contract grant. Just keep pushing the unstable narrative. I need her signature voided." I sat there for over an hour, numb. He wasn't just trying to make me feel small. He was trying to erase me. The wine he always poured, the late-night arguments he'd provoke right before my briefings, the way he'd sigh and tell me I needed rest. It wasn't supported. It was a setup. This wasn't just gaslighting. It was sabotage. I saved the files, every document, every email. I created backups and stashed them in cloud folders. I didn't say a word to Jake. I just smiled the next morning and asked if he wanted coffee, because now I wasn't just hurt. I was alert. And somewhere between betrayal and heartbreak, a plan was forming. In the weeks that followed, I became methodical. Every morning before work, I copied files. Every night, I documented interactions. I started recording short voice memos on my phone. But what I didn't expect was an anonymous message in my inbox. The subject line read, "You're not the only one." There was no name, just a phone number and a brief note. "Call if you're ready to stop feeling crazy." I hesitated for days. Then I dialed. A woman named Marissa answered, the wife of a fellow officer I barely knew. Her voice trembled when she said, "I know what Jake's doing. My husband did it too, and I think there are more of us." We met in a cafe 20 minutes off base. She brought printouts, recordings, and timelines. Her story mirrored mine with eerie precision. Then came Linda, another spouse. 3 women with different lives, linked by the same kind of slow, quiet sabotage. They'd been documenting too. We compared notes. Patterns emerged not just of emotional abuse, but coordinated manipulation. Men who played the long game. Women whose reputations were slowly unraveled under the guise of concern. It stopped being emotional and started feeling tactical. We weren't crying over coffee. We were building a file. We created a shared folder, created code names. I was Echo. Marissa was Falcon. Linda was Blue. We didn't vent. We planned. How to preserve timestamps. How to flag digital edits. How to track conversations without tipping anyone off. The fear didn't go away, but it shifted into something sharper. For the first time in months, I didn't feel alone. I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't losing my mind. I was part of something bigger, and that meant I had a shot at fighting back. I remember the moment we looked at each other across that cafe table and silently nodded. No words, just this shared look of quiet fire. We were no longer wives trying to hold it together. We were intel. We were recon. We were done waiting to be believed. The room was cold, even though the air conditioner barely whispered. I sat straight, uniform, crisp, my hands resting calmly on the folder in front of me. Jake sat across the table, confident in the way a man is when he thinks no one's caught him yet. His name was Jake Sullivan. My name was Captain Elise Carter. The tribunal had been called to review my conduct after concerning behavior had been reported. He submitted his notes, his concerns, his compiled list of moments that painted me as unstable. The panel flipped through his documents. I listened as he described me as overwhelmed, emotionally erratic, and possibly unfit for command. His voice was calm, practiced, too polished. When they turned to me for a response, I simply said, "I have some evidence I'd like to present." I pulled out my drive and handed it to the clerk. The screen behind me lit up. First came the recordings. Jake's voice, clear, calm, saying things like, "She's close to cracking, just a few more months, and I can push the paperwork." Ugh. Then came the emails to the retired major, laying out the plan. And then, the smoking gun. The email, linking his gaslighting campaign directly to the Phoenix Project. If I can get her flagged as unfit for command, I'll take the contract for myself. The room changed. The temperature, the air, the way everyone's Saturday, I wasn't finished. And my husband wasn't just planning this, I said. He had already started. The next slide showed the emails I found after the initial discovery. Messages to a contractor about redirecting preliminary funding through my name without approval. A proposal for Phase 2 of the project, submitted to a private vendor, with my forged digital signature. Jake's hands clenched. His face went pale, then red. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. One of the senior officers on the panel, a general, said, "Mr. Sullivan, please remain silent." That's when security stepped in. Calm, quiet, professional. "Jake Sullivan, you are under investigation for conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, coercion, and attempted sabotage of a federal officer." The cuffs clicked. He didn't struggle, just stared at me like he didn't recognize who I was. Maybe he didn't. Maybe I'd finally stopped being the woman he could twist into a version that made him feel powerful. I sat still until the door closed behind him. Then I exhaled, just once, quiet and full, like I hadn't taken a breath in years. After the tribunal, I took a leave of absence. It wasn't mandatory, but it was necessary. I needed space to breathe, to grieve, to figure out who I was without him. At first, I slept. For the first time in years, I let my body rest without guilt. Then, slowly, I started to move again. I spent a few weeks with my sister in Colorado. We hiked in the mornings and talked over coffee like we were still kids. She didn't ask too many questions. She just let me be quiet. That silence helped me hear my own thoughts again. When I returned to base, my office had been cleaned out. Jake's name had been stripped from every file he ever touched. But my team was still there. They stood when I walked in. No speeches, just respect. That moment mattered more than any medal I've ever received. It didn't take long before I was called in by senior command. They had reviewed everything. The case, the outcome, the fallout. What surprised me was what came next. They didn't just clear my name, they asked for my help. A new program was being drafted. One focused on leadership integrity, psychological safety, and ethical reporting. They wanted me to co-lead it, not as a victim, as an expert. I took the offer, not for revenge, but because I saw how much silence had cost me, and I didn't want another officer, male or female, to second-guess their sanity because someone they trusted decided to slowly erase them. The first workshop I ran was small, a group of junior leaders. I talked less about what Jake did, and more about what I ignored. The signs, the gut feelings, the excuses I made. In the name of loyalty, they listened, not with pity, with focus. I could see it in their faces, that mix of understanding and discomfort. That means the message is landing. Over time, word spread. My sessions are full. People reached out after class to share stories they'd never told anyone. Some were still in it. Some had just gotten out. I started getting asked to speak outside the base. Civilian leadership programs, ROTC events, podcasts. I didn't plan for any of it. But once I started telling the truth, I realized how many people were waiting to hear it. I didn't go back to the same role I had before. I moved into a new position, part policy, part training, part advocacy. It fits me now. I'm not just building strategy anymore. I'm building resilience. Some people still call me Captain Carter. Some call me Elise. I answer to both. What matters is that I know who I am when I do. There's a quiet pride in surviving something meant to break you, but there's power in making sure no one else has to survive it alone. Some nights, I still think about that version of me sitting in the hotel room after dinner, quiet, small, trying to decide whether I was overreacting or just tired. I didn't know then how deep the betrayal went. I just knew something was wrong. There were moments I truly believed I was losing it. Maybe I wasn't as strong as I thought. That maybe Jake saw something in me I couldn't face. But the truth was, I wasn't unraveling. I was waking up. Every moment of doubt, every second of silence, was part of the shift. It didn't feel like rebuilding at the time. It felt like breaking. Looking back, I see it more clearly. I see the line between who I used to be and who I've become. Not perfect, not invincible, but finally, whole. It took losing everything I thought made me secure to understand what strength really looked like. Not medals, not titles, not even survival. I knew I could lose all of that and still choose to stand. There were days when I wanted to stay quiet, to avoid the stares and the whispers. But every time I spoke, someone else found their voice too. That made it worth it. Jake didn't just try to break my career. He tried to break my sense of self. But in the end, he gave me something I didn't have before. Clarity, purpose, and a fire that doesn't dim. I don't tell this story because it's comfortable. I tell it because someone out there needs to hear it. Someone who's questioning their instincts. Someone who's been made to feel like they're too much, too sensitive, too dramatic. You're not. You're seeing something real. And you're stronger than they expect. So I'll end this by asking you what I once had to ask myself. Have you ever had to fight back just to prove you're not crazy?